In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to write an effective policy memo. This is a skill that's important for many public policy classes and may also be important in future jobs that you hold, particularly if they're in the advocacy or policy arenas. A policy memo is a short document that tries to convince a particular person or group to adopt a particular policy proposal. As I talk about how to write an effective policy memo, I'll be referring to two resources. First is the HMP 615 Canvas site, and second is this guide from the University of Chicago entitled How to Write a Policy Memo That Matters. If you'd like to find this guide for yourself, you can simply Google UChicago How to Write a Policy Memo That Matters. And the very first link here that pops up is a PDF file that contains this guide. There are a few things that can be done in a policy memo. And on page 2 of this guide from UChicago, we see some of the options of things that a policy memo can cover. So the first is descriptive. The descriptive aspect of a policy memo answers the question, what is happening? So this is where you would describe the current state of a policy problem and the current efforts that have taken place to try to solve that problem. So an example might be trying to answer the question, to what extent are women represented on US corporate boards? This is descriptive. The second aspect of a policy memo might be evaluative. This would answer the question, what is working? Or perhaps what is not working? So this is where you start to dive into the current interventions, the things that are good and the things that are bad about the status quo and the current interventions that are taking place. So an example might be, how effective is the Choose to Change program in reducing arrests for violent crime among the students who participate in it? So you can see here that the answer to this question is evaluating a particular program. The third option or component that a policy memo might have is prescriptive. This would answer the question, what should be done next? This is where you as the writer can make a recommendation about what you think should be done to solve a policy problem. An example might be, what policy options could help older workers who lost their jobs during the Great Recession regain employment? So this is where you have the opportunity to come up with an idea. An effective policy memo will generally answer all three of these questions. So there will be a descriptive component to the policy memo, an evaluative component to the policy memo, and a prescriptive component to the policy memo. So how would you go about getting started? The first thing that you need to do is to come up with an idea, and you can follow your passion in this regard. What is a policy problem or a public health issue that you think really needs to be solved or that you're really interested in? You also need to start doing some research on that particular topic and identify what interventions are already out there and what might be something that you could recommend to solve the problem. If you're struggling with this brainstorming stage or the research stage, I recommend you go back to Judy Smith's slides. Judy Smith was the Taubman Health Sciences librarian who came to speak to the course a few weeks ago. If you look on our Canvas site under 6 September guest speakers, you can find the resources that Judy Smith gave us. In particular, her slides are here. And the slides give lots of resources for identifying public policy topics that might be interesting to you and also conducting research on those topics. And in particular, if you're in the brainstorming stage, I recommend that you check out the Health Management and Policy Library Research Guide. So this is on slide 10 of Judy Smith's slideshow. There's a link right here. If I click on that, it takes me to the Health Management and Policy Library Research Guide. And there's lots of cool resources here. Just click around and see what interests you, what topics you might want to look into more for your policy memo. Another really useful tab here is the Policy Tracking and Analysis tab. If you click on that, you see quite a few policy tracking sites where they will take a particular issue, so for example, chronic disease, and they will track the various policies that have been implemented, perhaps in different states, perhaps in different countries, to address that issue. And so this can be a really good place to start to get ideas, or as you're starting to conduct your research. There are lots of options when you come to propose an actual recommendation. Some of those options could include your own creative idea. If you have come up with a unique and new idea about how to solve a particular policy problem, that is a valid topic for a policy memo. Another option might be to find a policy proposal from a think tank or researcher and to push for that particular solution. So a solution that someone else came up with, but that you think is a good solution. A third option might be to find a policy that has worked well in a particular state and advocate that it cross state lines. So perhaps California is doing something to address obesity that you think that Michigan should be doing. And so you can advocate that we sort of export that policy from another state. Perhaps even we could export a policy from another country. This has happened in the past, particularly on issues like healthcare, issues that all countries face. And then another option might be to look for an already existing piece of legislation within the country or within a particular state that addresses the issue you're interested in, and simply to advocate that that piece of legislation be passed. There may be other options too, but those are a few ways to think about getting started in terms of coming up with a recommendation. So let's say you have a topic, you've done some initial research, and you have an idea about what you want to recommend. Now you're ready to start writing. And when you go to start writing a policy memo, there's a particular format that is generally followed. So let's go over that a little bit. On the homepage of the HMP 615 Canvas site, if you scroll to the very bottom of the page, you'll see a link here that provides examples of assignments. Take a close look at the example policy memo. You can model your policy memo after this to ensure that you're following the right formatting guidelines. So I'll point out each section and kind of talk about the goal of each section. So first and foremost, at the top of the policy memo, you have a header in which you have a to, a from, a subject, and a date. The to is actually more important than it may seem. You want to try to identify a particular person who is responsible for the issue you're interested in, preferably someone who could make meaningful change on that issue. In this case, this person has targeted their policy memo to House Representative Phil Barnhart. Your person could be a state or federal legislator. It could be the chair of a particular committee. It could be a bureaucrat. There are quite a few options, but the goal is for you to do some research and figure out who could actually make change on the issue you're interested in. Another thing to think about is the ideology that that individual holds. You do not want to send your policy memo to someone who is going to take one look at it and throw it in the trash because they disagree ideologically with what you're saying. Instead, it's better to target a policy memo toward an individual who is perhaps on the fence about an issue and who might be convinced by your policy memo. You could also target your policy memo towards someone who you already know will be friendly towards your suggestion or receptive toward the particular ideological standpoint that you're coming from. But I would not recommend writing a policy memo to someone who you know will disagree with what you have to say. Let's look also at the from section. So in this policy memo, this individual writes on behalf of Oregon Health Authority. If you're writing an assignment for a course, don't advocate on behalf of a particular organization unless you actually have the authority to speak for that organization. Instead, just put your name, and you can put student at University of Michigan. The subject should clearly state the topic that you're addressing and should hint at the position that you're taking. And the data is self-explanatory. So let's go through each section. The first section is an executive summary. This is exactly what it sounds like, a summary of what you're going to say in the policy memo. Think about how busy policymakers often are. If you're sending this to a federal senator, they don't have a lot of time to be reading policy memos. So the executive summary should be a short paragraph that somebody could read and get the gist of what you're saying, could put the policy memo down and not have to continue reading if they don't want to. The main idea should be clearly conveyed in the executive summary. Next, you have the background section. This is where you lay out the policy issue and just give some general background information about the topic. This section should be quite objective. You do not want to use persuasive language in this section. You want to use lots of citations. Make sure that this section is well researched and that you're backing up your sentences with sources and facts. The time for persuasion will come later in the policy memo, but here you want to be as objective as possible. You can also talk in the background section about what has already been done to try and address a particular issue. But again, stay away from evaluation. Try not to say this legislative effort was good or was bad. Instead, simply lay out the legislative efforts that have taken place and their effects. Next, we proceed into the more persuasive section of the policy memo. So here we see a reject the status quo section. This is where the author starts to frame this policy issue as a policy problem. So here is where the call to action can happen, and where some of the outstanding issues that have not been adequately addressed by existing legislation or policy can be outlined. Then we move into the recommendation section. And now we are in full persuasive mode, because now you are telling the person who you're writing the policy memo to take a particular action. Notice that that particular action has been put in bold. That's a very effective way to really highlight what exactly you want the person to do. I recommend you do that in your policy memos. And in this paragraph, we are in full-on persuasive mode, and I recommend that you use a deductive writing style, meaning that your very first sentence outlines your main point or what you want the person to do, and then the subsequent sentences provide evidence and back up that recommendation. To make your argument stronger, we include a section called counter arguments. You could have 2, 3, or 4 counter arguments, depending on how much space you have left in your policy memo. But in the counter arguments section, you want to think about what are some common objections that people might have to your policy suggestion. So for example, this person writing this policy memo thinks that one common objection to the proposed policy is that a mandate will hurt businesses. Then the author addresses that objection and tries to show how that objection isn't actually valid, or how the policy they're proposing actually also solves that particular objection. This may take a little bit of research. You can try to look on the other side of the aisle. If your policy proposal is associated with a particular party, look at what the other party is saying about those kind of policies. Take those common arguments and then kind of fight back against them in this section. Finally, we have the conclusion. Your conclusion should be short, and it should generally end on kind of a memorable and empowering note. You want to reiterate the recommendation that you're making and make sure that it kind of sticks in the reader's mind. And then of course, at the end, we have references. For the policy memos in this course, we do not particularly care which reference style you use. APA is a very common reference style used in policy memos, so you can go with that. However, any reference or citation style is totally acceptable as long as you are consistent. So we care much more about consistency and the fact that you do references or endnotes rather than the specifics of which style you're using and how you're formatting things. As you're writing your policy memo, if you want to double check that you have accomplished the goals of the assignment well, you can check out the University of Chicago PDF file again. On page 8 of the PDF, there's a sort of a checklist that you can follow for your own policy memo to see if you have effectively written a policy memo. So you can go through these questions and kind of check, is the problem you're trying to solve clearly articulated? And then if that's the case, great. If not, you can go back and edit that part of your policy memo to make sure that it's clear. I think that's about it. I hope this is helpful for you as you write your first policy memo. Feel free to reach out by email if you have further questions. And I'm really looking forward to reading your solutions to common public health policy issues.